Okay, then I think that we can start the Twitter space. Before we dive into the topic of today, I'd like to give a brief introduction to why we're doing this Twitter space and also who are the Cypherpunk Guild, just for those of you on the public that might not be familiar with it. So the Cypherpunk Guild is a group of privacy activists that are dedicated to reestablishing privacy in the digital domain and to promote values of crypto-anarchism. And cypherpunks and crypto-anarchists, they specifically try to address the ever more pervasive state interference in all matters of human experience through the use of advanced cryptography and technology to protect, in particular, freedom of speech and also allow for greater economic freedom. And there is a lot of overlaps between the cypherpunk movement and anarchy, but is not often discussed among crypto communities because people tend to focus on technology, leaving out political theory. However, I think that it's very important to discuss also this aspect because it can give rise to more ideas and more solutions. So I think that this is the main reason behind us organizing this Twitter space to basically bring some more ideas and discussions on anarchy to the new ecosystem in particular, but to the crypto communities in general. And there is a lot of misconceptions surrounding anarchism, which prevent the general public from engaging in a serious discussion on that. And one of them, which is the most popular perhaps, is the idea that anarchism presupposes the lack of any rule and that humans are inherently incapable of cooperating for the achievement of common goals, unless they're directed from a higher authority, which is the state. So in this Twitter space, we're going to discuss these assumptions together with Mutualism Co-op and provide a more nuanced view of anarchism. Mutualism Co-op, for those that are not familiar with it, is an anarchist collective that curates and promotes political theory related to mutualist anarchism. And now I'll just give you guys the opportunity to introduce yourself and Mutualism Co-op and the idea behind it.
Yeah, sure. I guess I can jump in there and go first, Railing. My name's Joel. I've been involved in several different activist projects over the years, and Mutualism Co-op is the latest iteration of sort of what I've been experimenting with. But I guess to give a brief overview of what Mutualism Co-op is, like you said, we're an anarchist collective interested in spreading the ideas of stateless cooperation, free association, and reciprocity by curating and collecting political theory related to mutualist anarchism. You can think of us as sort of a mutualist library that produces and republishes text and media in order to help further the understanding and development of mutualist anarchist thought. So we're interested in giving mutualism a larger reach, not only within the anarchist world, but we're also ultimately interested in helping to normalize anarchy as a legitimate proposal within political philosophy as a whole. And finally, we're interested in seeing more real-world anarchist experimentation and mutualist alternatives to the coercive and hierarchical status quo. And so we'd love to inspire brave souls to construct alternative institutions and ways of being that help us progress towards a liberated world within the shell of the old.
Love to hear that. So, Railing, would you like to introduce yourself or add anything on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I also got involved in anarchy quite a few years ago, and I started this project with Joel and a few others. I don't really have much to say beyond that.
Okay, then we can start with the first question, which is, what is mutual anarchism? And what is the main difference between these and other kinds of anarchism?
Sure. So I can sort of provide a sort of brief overview of mutualism. Um, I would define mutualism as a sort of positive way to phrase anarchism. So anarchism talks about what kind of relationships we'd like to negate and what kind of relationships we oppose. So, for example, people describe anarchy is described as like the negation of authority, which I would define as a social relationship where some parties have the right to give orders and others have the corresponding obligation to obey. And mutualism talks about the kind of relationships we'd like to replace those with. And those would be ones based on reciprocity, mutuality, symmetries, and balances of power. Um, so, if I could kind of abstractly describe a mutualist society, it would be a framework where change flows from the bottom up. Individuals and groups can freely associate with each other on their own terms, and basically navigate a space with no mechanisms for top-down social control, which basically means like internalizing costs and coming to collective decisions horizontally. Um, so, if I would say that an anarchist society is generally permissive, except in cases of like normatively defined harm. And from there, you probably derive accountability from like distributed peer-to-peer consensus. And I think Joel would probably have something to add on that as well.
Well, no, yeah, I totally agree with railing on that. I mean, it's a way of exploring what we want freedom for, and I think at the co-op at least, we see mutualism as a living, breathing, ongoing project that not only opposes the state, the economic systems which grow from it, as well as all other coercive means of control and manipulation, but mutualism also seeks to bring about a stateless economic order where individuals act in accordance with their willingness and desire within the realm of equal liberty. So specifically, that might mean supporting things like egalitarian networks of trade, or maybe worker ownership over the means of production, and stigmergic property relations that default to the principle of occupancy and use. So in contrast to, actually existing capitalist markets, we advocate for sort of a bottom-up experimental market coordination process where reciprocity is upheld through social and institutional norms based on equality and justice. So for sure, the tendency to support the utilization of anti-capitalist markets is one way in which mutualism is unique among other proclivities within the anarchist tradition. And I think also another way in which mutualism stands apart from other schools within anarchism is that it's very pragmatic, and that it advocates for a mode of organizing that reaches beyond the limitations of social systems which rely solely on goodwill. So basically, we don't feel that it's necessary to make certain assumptions about human nature in order for mutualism to work. For instance, instead of assuming that people are inherently good or bad, we simply acknowledge that people at a base level are basically self-interested creatures. Mutualism, I think, is interested in harnessing the expression of that self-interest into a truly social system that allows each unique individual to flourish within the realm of equal liberty, like I was saying earlier. So simply put, we think mutual aid is great. You often hear about anarchists talking about how important it is. We also think mutualism is important and mutual aid is important and necessary. But additionally, we think it's an insufficient means towards facilitating true human flourishing, and that social complexity requires arrangements that not only utilize peer-to-peer support and fraternity, but also acknowledge and harness the power of incentive through free contract and trade.
Yeah, definitely. But I think that here we touch upon like one of the first prejudices, let's say, or like wrong assumptions about anarchy that is very much related to what we think about human nature. That is that humans in the state of nature basically if they're not put in check by an authority, they would be basically acting against each other all the time. And I think that this is one of the main barriers for people to really like take anarchy into consideration, because it's looked at as an utopian endeavor, because but it's simply not possible that we expect people to be decent unless we put um, some kind of coercive measures in place that make sure that they do not engage in appalling behavior. So, what would you say about that? And also about the main struggles for anarchists today to talk about anarchy?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of those points. There's a lot of misrepresentations of anarchy. Like just in general, whenever I bring up anarchy to like friends or whatever, they always take it to mean chaos or like a certain aesthetic, which I'm all for. But it's seen as utopian because I think most people see the state as legitimate, and they aren't aware of stateless societies, and like the historical prevalence of stateless societies, the present day prevalence of stateless societies, of which there are like many examples, like Zomia. And they also believe falsehoods about the government. Um, in that they think it provides people with safety, food, water, and shelter. When I think it's often the exact opposite. And we have a lot of examples of people coordinating without a state, like Eleanor Ostrom. A lot of Eleanor Ostrom's works talks about stateless coordinations and the way individuals manage the commons collectively. So that the anarchist critique argues that the state exists to reproduce concentrations of power and perpetuate economic rent, where corporations benefit at the expense of others. So things like taxation, government policy, broadly cement this relationship by crowding out competition, and any benefit to individuals, I would argue, is incidental and zero sum. And I think Joel would also have some more to say about this.
No, yeah, totally. I mean, one struggle that I often come across when talking about anarchy is along the lines of what we just touched on in that last question and what you just alluded to. But people often dismiss anarchy and think anarchists are naive fools who have too much trust in humanity. I can't count how many times I've heard that sort of knee-jerk response from people. But I basically think this assumption is a product of living in a culture that worships hierarchy. And it's not that people are too uncreative to think outside the box of the status quo. It's that from the moment of birth, we learn to accept coercion and domination as normal simply because of its pervasiveness. It's everywhere. Our relationships are often patriarchal. We live in an economy where the majority of ordinary people are forced to work for a wage in order to survive. But because of propaganda efforts and the general, what you might call conservative impulse to not rock the boat, I think people usually default to the understanding that their current situations are just acceptable. Because I think a lot of people assume that while society as we know it may have its flaws, it is at a minimum the evil we know and have come accustomed to tolerating, as opposed to the possible evil we don't know that could be lurking, in the shadows of statelessness. But I actually think that this is another way in which mutualism might appeal to the average person, because mutualism has a tendency to support a type of gradualism as opposed to formal revolution that sometimes we hear talked about in other anarchist spaces. So in this way, mutualism offers something with lower stakes emotionally, because the process of gradual experimentation and freedom feels less risky than revolution or a thin conception of anarchy as mere statelessness.
So at this point, I would like to ask you like more of a personal question on this. Like, how did you come to basically be interested in anarchy and to see that as a very appealing political idea?
Rayling, I think you have an more interesting origin story than me.
I mean, my interest in anarchy kind of originated from, yeah, I guess there's quite a few different things that drew me to anarchy. One of them was not having much financial freedom. At one point I was undocumented, so I didn't have access to banking, so that's what drew me to anarchism. Um, so yeah, it's kind of stuff like that, you know?
Rayling, you started off as an anarchist communist, right?
Yeah. I mean, I started as an anarchist communist and then kind of developed from there. Most of that development just came from arguments on Discord. I think like a lot of the time the default state for anarchists is for people to get introduced to anarcho-communism through things like Reddit. And I started exploring from there.
Yeah. For me, I grew up in a neoconservative family. I discovered American libertarianism and kind of gravitated towards that for a while. I read, economics and stuff like that, and became more interested in agorist ideas, and then finally discovered more individualist anarchist thinkers. And then from there, that's they're cousins to mutualist thinkers often. So just reading more about mutualism, engaging in the works of Kevin Carson and people like that, sort of got me to gradually accept and come to the position that I am at currently.
Okay, interesting. Like I'm always curious to know how people got to that because it's really unpopular. So I'm always curious, oh, how does someone come to like flirt with this idea and actually embrace that? Like for me was mainly about seeing how certain things didn't make sense in society, like to delegate to the state even the main like things that people can do themselves and they're prevented from doing just because they're waiting for a state law, for instance, in order to organize and fix a problem that is affecting their community in a local way. And so for me, that was one of the main things that drove me into anarchism because I saw so many glitches in the way that society is works today that seems very
Right.
strange. So
Sure. Yeah, totally.
I would like to discuss a bit more the idea of selfishness and the take that you have on that. How is it accounted for in anarchy? Because usually it's something that is used as an argument uh, against anarchism because, oh, well, people are selfish, so that's why we need an authority to prevent this selfishness to take over. What would be your response to that?
Sure. Yeah, I kind of briefly alluded to that earlier, and it might be worth sort of separating selfishness and self-interest, which is usually how I like to think of it. But I think at a deep level, humans are simply self-interested. Uh, I think that, additionally, I think that an individual self-interest can't really fully be understood or realized outside of relation to other people. So in a very real way, our wants and desires are intimately intertwined with others. Your freedom is my freedom, and acknowledging that can encourage us to act in a way that aligns our self-interest and promotes cooperation. So the will to power, as Nietzsche coined it, or the tendency to dominate and rule over others, threatens a healthy expression of social life and is ultimately just a misguided attempt to express what I would call a self-interested will to freedom. But if Kropotkin, as a lot of people are familiar with, if Kropotkin, for instance, is correct about the natural instinct towards individual liberty or freedom of association, it's because those tendencies are actually in our self-interest. So self-preservation is good for cooperation, and cooperation is good for self-preservation.
To add to Joel's points, I don't think whether anarchism works has anything to do with selfishness or other personal traits individuals might have. Like that retort to anarchism is actually one I've seen quite often, and I think it kind of misses the point. So, like, given scarce resources and labor, people would have to coordinate in order to meet each other's needs and wants, and they'd come up with incentives to that purpose for that purpose. So, you could coordinate using a market where people explicitly withhold the products of their labor unless other parties reciprocate, or you could, coordinate in other ways where you implicitly withhold products of your labor unless other parties reciprocate, like in gift economies. And just kind of a segue on this point, one of the critiques market anarchists often get from the other side is that this framework discriminates against people who can't produce physical goods and services. But we're actually working with a very wide definition of reciprocity as mutualists, which includes simply valuing someone's existence. So, like in a communistic setting, you could also imagine that if people don't value the existence of a given group of people, then they wouldn't necessarily meet their needs and wants. But yeah, getting back to the point, in this framework, it's in the self-interest of selfish people to cooperate with others. So, a friend of mine had a good quote, which goes something along the lines of, either humans are nice and kind, in which case rulership is unnecessary, or humans are like evil and nasty, in which case rulership is inherently self-serving. And I think another kind of a similar problem to one like selfishness is one of violence, and that's kind of what a lot of anarchists are talking about right now. Where I think that any individual or association's capacity for violence is countervailed by the fact that they're economically and socially interdependent on a whole bunch of other people around them who have a vested interest in not becoming a state. Like there have been many examples of stable stateless societies that have existed for like thousands of years, like Zomia. So they end up having no real capacity for anything but like self-defense and security. So, I think there isn't necessarily a gain to them becoming a state.
Yeah, on this point, it made me think about like a really interesting book that I'm reading right now, which is called The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow. And they are basically talking about what you just mentioned, which is there is so many false assumptions in anthropology that makes us think that it's impossible to live in a society other than what we have, because unless we are primitives, basically. And they are challenging these assumptions by looking at different sources, anthropological sources, which is similar to what Kropotkin also did in his book Mutual Aid. But of course, it's a more recent research, and that I think it's very interesting, and it gives like a lot of perspective to counter this idea that we cannot live in a different way than we are living, considering the growth that we reached as populations. So would really recommend this read. Mm-hmm. But before, you mentioned gradualism, which is one of the aspects that distinguish mutualism from other kinds of anarchy. And I would like to ask you on, like, it's kind of a big question, but what would it take to realize like an anarchy idea in real world, basically? What are the first steps? What can we do basically to make it happen?
Rayling, why don't we do this? I think you're pretty good at like explaining like quickly what a mutualist anarchist society is. So maybe we should articulate like what a mutualist anarchist society might look like, and then maybe I can expound on how we might get there.
Sure, that works well.
So, like in an abstract sense, I think like mutualism, like I guess as we've already said, mutualist anarchism and anarchists in general would argue in favor of a society without authority, which includes government and other systems. So I try not to be prescriptive because anarchy could look very different based on how different people choose to organize. But broadly speaking, and this is kind of central to the anarchist critique of the state and mutualism, is that anarchy entails the erosion of economic rent or social relationships where some parties benefit at the expense of others, which forms the basis for a lot of the anarchist critique of anarchism. So basically, like the state skews bargaining power in favor of privileged entities like capital versus labor, or undocumented labor versus documented labor, allowing them to accumulate wealth and power, which further skews bargaining power. And a lot of different anarchist theorists talk about the origin of some of these dynamics. Like, for example, Benjamin Tucker talks about the four monopolies, the money monopoly, where only banks are allowed to issue credit, which allows them to charge an artificially high rate of interest. Otherwise, like I guess in a society with mutual credit and where credit is not scarce and anyone is free to issue credit, you'd probably see the cost of borrowing converge to zero. And that's kind of what you saw in societies that did use mutual credit that have been covered by David Graeber in Debt. The second one he talks about is the land monopoly, which goes back to the mass expropriation of the commons. He talks about tariffs, which limit competition and protect large incumbent firms from foreign competition. And he also talks about patents, intellectual property. Kevin Carson covers a few more examples in The Iron Fist Behind the Invisible Hand, which I recommend. Yeah, so in The Iron Fist Behind the Invisible Hand, Carson talks about the subsidy of history, which is kind of similar to Tucker's discussion of the land monopoly, where Kevin Carson goes into the history of how peasants were deprived of their own land and access to the commons, which forced them to work in factories. He also talks about the money monopoly, infrastructure spending, where taxpayer funds are used to facilitate economies of scale, which he otherwise argues would be infeasible. There'd probably be there's probably many examples of state intervention in the economy which skews bargaining power in favor of capitalists. I would argue that even since a lot of people here are probably involved in the crypto space, banning tools that anonymize transactions, like Tornado.cash, effectively allow the state to tax people and forces people into the banking system, where you end up paying wire transfer fees and stuff like that. So there's a lot of different laws. I would even argue that something as fundamental as fixed title and deed over property helps sort of cement these relationships. So, if I had to give a specific example, it would be like, I would ask, like, why is it profitable for corporations to burn down forests and displace indigenous people and pollute water systems and the atmosphere? And I think a broad answer is that they've been empowered by the state through things like private property protection, subsidies, tax breaks, and kickbacks. And all this allows them to externalize costs onto third parties. So without government intervention, there'd be less incentive to do these things, in terms of financial reward and the possibility of consequences, like people defending themselves. So, I think an anarchic response to authority would address all of these issues. So, to kind of answer your question in an abstract sense, I think that would involve unraveling a lot of, our dependencies on the government. It would involve destroying or repurposing infrastructure that subsidizes choices that externalize costs onto others. And you'd have more bottom-up, increasingly local organizing, where the allocation of costs is mediated between individuals instead of simply externalized onto workers by a state. So, if I was to give more specific examples, since this is all still quite abstract, I would say that we'd be looking at institutions like DeFi, mutual banking, squats, piracy, micro manufacturing, worker co-ops, mutual aid societies. There'd be a lot of examples of things that I think institutions that I think would be more prevalent in a mutualist anarchist society. More decentralized systems that are more illegible to the government and hence more difficult to control. I think Joel can talk more about real world examples.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I agree with everything you just said, Railing. I mean, I think anytime anyone asks the question of like how anarchy would be achieved or how mutualist anarchism would be achieved, I mean, I think you should preface it with the acknowledgement that the arrow of anarchy never ends, and that there will always be new freedoms waiting to be discovered, even in a mutualist anarchist society. That said, I think that the path towards mutualism can, like we were saying earlier, can be realized gradually through the creation of alternatives to the coercive status quo. So as far as like mutualist tactics go, Raidling mentioned Eleanor Ostrom earlier. I think experimentation in widespread commons arrangements would be great, kind of like looking at existing arrangements also and just sort of using that model to expand it more and more. Raidling also mentioned cooperatives. I think the cooperative movement is an ever-growing and potentially promising piece to the puzzle. Police abolition, as that continues to be considered and stressed culturally and politically. Clarence Lee Swartz has talked about cooperative defense associations. I think that'd be great thing to try out or see more of. The left wing of cryptocurrency and blockchain technology and what they're trying to do with public goods is really great. Encryption tools are another way in which you might be able to help gradually grow mutualism. Railing mentioned Kevin Carson. Another book of his is The Homebrew Industrial Revolution, which makes a pretty convincing case about do-it-yourself home technology and and how it's increasingly becoming cheaper and more available. Along similar but different lines, Four Thieves Vinegar Collective is doing incredible work. Most people should be familiar with them, but they're famous for a lot of things. But most recently, their proliferation of things such as homemade abortion pills and other potentially life-saving technology, which is very relevant since Roe v. Wade ended in the States. And of course, on the cultural and educational side of things, I think it's important that we continue supporting independent media. It's important that we continue to support those advocating for online privacy and a free internet, such as the Cypherpunk Guild. And of course, propaganda efforts for mutualism seem pretty necessary for growing a mutualist society. So organizations like Non-Servient Media, Center for a Stateless Society, and what we're doing at Mutualism Co-op all seem essential in our efforts to grow awareness about mutualism.
Yeah, these are all very interesting ideas, and I think that in here there is the value of creating a kind of bridge between the people that can build new tools and those that have ideas of what could be good to envision for society and ways of experimenting. Because I feel that in the blockchain space there is a lot of interest, of course, in creating new things that can really shift paradigms when it comes to finance and other aspects that are really intertwined with anarchism and with providing more options and more freedom to people. But there is still a lack of more political theories, let's say, in the space, which I think it's really important to introduce so that people can really think about these as a tool to really bring forth a new way of organizing society, which I feel that we haven't changed anything in a really long time. Like if we consider the technological advancement that happened in the past 100 years, and then we look at the way we organize society, like there is a really huge mismatch, and it really needs to be filled. And I think that this is one of the ways in which we can make it happen, to basically make political theories converge more with technology. What are your thoughts on that? What do you think? How do you see technology playing a role in that? And is there something that you find particularly exciting in the crypto space that could perhaps like help the anarchist movement?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty interesting way of putting it. People often don't really stress the political implications of technology. It's often seen as politically neutral. And, in terms of technology and anarchy, I think it's a pretty interesting intersection. On the positive side, we have the fact that, technology creates more freedom in that it provides people with avenues to exit and express themselves. So, the more options people have, the more bargaining power they have. So from the perspective of labor power, I would argue that giving people more options and tools in terms of technology enables both market and non-market competition into the context of a state. Technology also gives people the tools to evade detection. I think, for example, in Nigeria, people were there was an anti-police brutality movement, and they were banned from the banking sector, and they received donations from Bitcoin. In terms of crypto specifically, I think that crypto as like a politically neutral financial substrate is kind of an underplayed narrative, even though that was kind of one of the founding principles. Like people are always looking for new narratives, especially because of the fact that crypto also trades is also traded as a financial asset. But I feel like that's kind of like a core narrative for crypto, and that'll always be something that's pretty important for it. Stuff like 3D printing provides people with the means for self-defense. We have, I think, micro manufacturing is a very interesting trend. And even outside of going back to cryptocurrency, actually, even outside of capitalism, I think that crypto creates more ways for people to organize financially, because everything that isn't on the blockchain, I think categorically is based on trust. And for people who can't navigate that landscape, crypto creates new possibilities. So, you can exit the existing financial system. I personally use crypto to just easily transfer funds because I prefer the user experience. I think that's actually something I disagree with a lot on people. Like people always DeFi needs a better user experience, but I find DeFi to be pretty great in the sense that when I wire transfer money, and this isn't necessarily related to anarchy, but whenever I try to whenever you wire transfer money, you have to put in a bunch of details, whereas with DeFi you can just it's pretty trivial. And then kind of going back to the point, technology is also a double-edged sword, and it's kind of important to acknowledge that technologies such as this, the centralized production apparatus of capitalism. You've got your criminal profiling algorithms, weapon systems, surveillance, all serve to kind of reproduce concentrations of power and hence antithetical to anarchy. So I think what anarchy can do is kind of fight back on the technological front by kind of creating a different technological trajectory. So, for example, without the externalization of costs onto third parties, just to give an example, I think the relative price of plant-based alternatives to fossil fuels would go down, given the externalities of oil and gas, resulting in, I guess, plant-based alternatives to plastics derived from bananas and hemp becoming more price efficient, since they're currently pretty infeasible. I would also argue that anarchism would decrease the relative price of labor versus capital, because with increased bargaining power, people would be able to work less for more compensation. So I think that technology has different trajectories, and under anarchy, it would take a very different trajectory to what we're seeing right now, with, for example, more emphasis on labor saving technology.
Yes, and I think that it's really important that we keep having this kind of discussions, because we really need to push people to have demands on the kind of technology that they want to see, and the kind of technology that helps them gain more freedom and empowerment instead of more surveillance and control. And I think that in here, people that are kind of in the intersection between political theory and technology can do a lot for creating awareness on the fact that we should have demands on what on we should influence basically the way technology develops and it is used, because it can have like a huge impact on our life, and it should be for the better and not for the worst. So at this point, kind of to come to a conclusion with our Twitter space, I would like to ask you, what are some suggestions that you have for people that are kind of interested in anarchy or are flirting with that? What are the best ways to basically enter into anarchy, and also how can people contribute to Mutualism Co-op?
Yeah. So as far as contributing to Mutualism Co-op goes, follow us on Twitter, donate crypto, become a patron, and try to help us maintain the cost of having our website and the labor that goes into curating and creating the articles that we post and save on there. And then Railing has been doing a good job at reminding me that we need to continue to stress that we're always looking for authors too. So if you're interested in contributing new material, we'd be happy to review that. And in addition to that, submitting like various types of media to us would be great. So if there's a YouTube video that you think is great that explores mutualism, feel free to send us a message on Twitter or hit us up through Proton Mail. As far as like suggestions about learning more about anarchy, that's what you asked, right?
Yeah.
Well, obviously, Mutualism Co-op is a great place to start.
Yes.
When it comes to mutualist anarchy, at least. Center for a Stateless Society is a great place to learn about sort of bigger tent left-wing market anarchism. If you want to zoom out even more, the Anarchist Library is packed full of classical and contemporary anarchist literature. I love that resource. I'd say support and look into anarchists such as Sean Wilbur. He's a historian and a translator. We wouldn't have mutualism as we know it today without him, and any resources directed in that direction, I think, is your money well spent. Same goes for Kevin Carson, too, obviously. He no longer calls himself a mutualist, but he's more into anarchism without adjectives, but still sort of exists within that sphere, I suppose, and is a valuable resource as far as mutualism goes, especially his past work. But beyond reading stuff, we'd encourage folks to actually try to put boots on the ground and try to help the creation of liberatory alternatives. So starting your own way to help people to be more free is great, but it's also a good idea to reach out to existing projects that pique your interest in order to see if you can help them succeed as well.
Yes. I hope that we'll keep in touch and maybe organize one of these talks again. It was really nice to talk to you guys, and it's always refreshing and heartwarming to hear like people sharing the same perspectives that you have on the world and talk about it together. So thanks for coming, and I hope that people found that interesting as well and will now start implementing anarchy in their life.
Thanks for having us. It's been good.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was a blast.
Great. Okay, then have a nice weekend, everyone, and see you next time.
Sounds great. Thanks. Bye.
Bye bye.